Right. Sorry, we're a couple of minutes late, guys. Just a few tech issues there. Good morning. It's Tuesday. It's the 10th. It must be ESG measurement. So as many of you know, I'm Steve Smedley, Acuity Associate, and welcome to our 5th webinar in our spring series. I'd also like to welcome John Wickenden from HouseMark, who's going to be taking a look at ESG reporting, specifically the ESG reporting that's come out of the voluntary sustainability reporting standard for social housing. As always, social housing has very snappy titles. So obviously, this form of ESG reporting, I think, goes some way to deal with a real long-standing thorny issue of how the sector measures its positive contribution to people, place and planet. So I know from all my years working in the sector, but also working with Acuity customers, this has just perplexed people for absolutely ages, trying to get the, if you like, the value of social housing in totality, in terms of what our businesses generate. So it will be dead interesting to see what John comes up with. So before I hand over to John, just the tedious housekeeping stuff. This is scheduled to last for an hour. John will be taking questions. Please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screens to post brief and succinct to the point questions. I'll sift through them and put them to John verbally. We will be recording this, so that will be available for you to refer back to, but also to point any colleagues who can't make it today to point them in the right direction. We'll also be sticking a copy of John's slides on the website. John, can I just ask you if you want to take questions right at the end or at logical pauses as we go through?
I think at logical pauses, please.
Right, brilliant. Well, you just flag to me when you want to do that. And so, without further ado, over to you, John.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Right, so I'm just going to share my screen now, try and work out which one to share. So let me know, Steve, when you can see that. Can you see the slides? Yep. Great. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Right. So I'm going to talk to you about environmental, social, and governance benchmarking. Just a quick overview. So I'm going to look at what it is, then collecting it, what we've done at HouseMark to collect it, the analysis report we published last year, and we produced last year, and then looking at what we will do with ESG benchmarking in 2022. Okay, so just a quick overview of HouseMark, just in case you're not aware of HouseMark. We do benchmarking, data comparison and analysis. We do it monthly and annually, and we try and add in a sort of a soupçon of sector sentiment into that, so that we're kind of taking what's going on externally and analysing that and thinking about how it affects our members who are social landlords, how it affects the sector, what's likely to happen in the future. We also deal a lot in best practice. So we have clubs set up for operational managers to discuss best practice. We also gather that through our research exercises. Part of what we do is in identifying trends, gathering insight, and producing forecasts. We've got 2 decades of data going backwards, so we're able to kind of look at what has happened in the past, the effect of the pandemic, the effect of other things like government policy, and then how that might affect performance, satisfaction, costs going forward. Okay, and we're jointly owned by the Chartered Institute of Housing and the National Housing Federation. Right, so on to ESG. So what I've kind of done this, so Steve's brief to me was ESG for Dummies. So I've kind of started off at a sort of fairly base level, so I'll kind of go through it, but I will give you an opportunity to ask questions as we go through. So the starting point for this is that ESG criteria, that they've been devised by financial institutions. So the whole point of it is that they can have a financial institution, bank, lender, funding organization can assess whether somebody that's applying for a loan, in the simplest possible terms, has kind of socially conscious ways of doing things, and whether they are doing the right things in terms of for the environment, they're sort of contributing to society and making sure that they're properly governed. There's not sort of things going on, questionable practices going on in terms of the board and the executive and the relationships there. So the whole idea about this is that financial products can be given at preferential rates where a loan applicant shows these kind of good ESG credentials. In fact, some financial institutions, I've heard them still say that at the moment it's sort of preferential rates, but kind of going down the line, you go 5-10 years down the line, it might well be essential for landlords to show these ESG standards, show their adherence to ESG criteria in order to get a loan. So rather than it just being a get a better rate, it will be a yes/no flag in the future. And it's also quite useful to identify companies that do have questionable ethics and business practices. So there's quite a lot of emphasis in financial institutions at the moment to sort of find sort of morally just causes to fund. Okay, so just bringing that down from a kind of a global point of view about ESG to looking at how it affects social housing. So a few years back, a group of investors and landlords got together to create the sustainability and reporting standard for environmental, social and governance in social housing. So it's specifically aimed at landlords working in social housing. It does seem to be more geared to housing associations, private registered providers than local authorities, just because of some of the measures that are in there about governance are more geared up to that structure than how a local authority operates. But the whole idea is that it gives a standardized basis for investors to kind of understand what UK social housing is all about, what it does well, what it does for the society, how it contributes to environmental goals, and the kind of the robust governance arrangements that are in place. So the sustainability and reporting standard, there are 48 criteria and they go across these 3 areas. I'm going to go into a bit more detail about that. But there's over 120 organisations have signed up to it, mainly housing associations. If you look at the list of adopters, so there is a website for this that I put the link into here on the slide, and there's a whole list of adopters on there, mainly housing associations, not so many in Scotland, but certainly there are plenty England and Wales landlords that are taking part in it. But there have been involvement from Scottish landlords as well, and from the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations input into the process to get these criteria sort of set up, really. So there's a whole list of who was involved. So quite a lot of large housing associations and financial institutions based across the UK, really. So you're looking at like the Good Economy were involved. You've got some G15 landlords, L&Q, Optivo, Peabody, and so there's quite a lot of the great and the good of housing associations there. Okay, so if you've got any questions, just pop them in the chat and Steve will halt me and I'll answer them. Okay, so just looking at the ESG criteria that we've got. So looking at environmental. So I approached this by thinking, okay, if I was a landlord thinking, can I measure this? What sort of things are in there? Is it something that I can do? I think if you were looking to the financial markets to kind of apply for a loan, it's certainly worth adopting. And the environmental criteria we've got in there, looking at things like EPC ratings. So that's saying, what proportion of your stock fits into the 7, 8 EPC bandings, and it kind of says, and it gives lenders an idea about how energy efficient your stock is and how robust it will be, and then that also suggests how much investment might be required to bring all stock up to an EPCC rating. So if you've got a comparatively high proportion down in D, E, F, etc., then you're going to need a fair amount of money to actually invest in your stock to bring it up to that EPCC, which is deemed as the right level to bring social housing stock up to achieve UK climate and emissions targets. So it also looks at greenhouse gas emissions. This is an area that is kind of cross industry. So you've got, it breaks it down into scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. I'm not a big expert on how these are collected, but essentially what you're looking at is saying, okay, this is what I produce as a landlord. These are the emissions I produce from my, fleet of vehicles, or from the non-residential buildings that we operate. This is the emissions that our contractors produce, and then you've got the emissions from the actual stock that you own that would come from residents as well. And there's quite a lot of estimation involved in this, but it's an area where I think landlords need to gain more and more understanding going forward, certainly in if you're looking at decarb work, to be able to sort of measure before and after. Then there's a few open-ended questions on action and engagement. So what have you done in terms of climate change, and how are you engaging residents? There's a kind of common theme coming through quite a lot of this, in that in order to sort of prove your ESG credentials, you need to be able to demonstrate that you are engaging with residents and opening a dialogue with residents about any actions they need to take or lifestyle changes they might need. It's, for example, if they're living in an energy efficient home. There's a couple of questions in there on ecology. So that's just looking at promoting biodiversity. So things like what sort of green spaces do you have as part of your estate, and also looking at how you reduce pollution. So quite a lot of these questions in the ESG sort of form, as it were, are open-ended. So it's an opportunity for you to produce a report and sort of state what you are doing in sort of words, rather than just boiling it down to a simple number. So there's another section about environmental, which is looking at resource management. So that's primarily whether you've got sort of waste management plans in process, to and what you do with your waste, what your contractors do with the waste when they're working on your properties. And also looking at responsible procurement. That's another theme that's quite sort of common throughout this, is to make sure that, yes, you've got ESG credentials as a social landlord, but what about the people you're buying from? How much does that responsibility go forward into your procurement processes? Okay, so I'll just pause for questions.
Okay. No questions so far, John, but again,
Okay.
I'd encourage people to use the Q&A function at the bottom of their screens to pose their questions. I'll have some questions, John, but I think if you plow on, we'll hoover some up a bit later, yeah? Okay,
no problem. Right, so moving on to the social criteria that are part of the ESG sustainability and reporting standard. So, I mean, there's some quite simple questions in here. I think for social landlords, this is probably the simplest part to enter data for. So affordability and security, so it's quite simply looking at things like average rents, how your rents are indexed to market rent in the areas that you manage stock, what kind of tenures you offer. So, you know, information that you could probably get from any returns you make to the regulator of social housing or your social housing regulator. There's also questions about building safety and quality, so that's looking at compliance, so broadly similar to what the regulator of social housing has put in its consultation for English landlords. So, you know, looking at things like gas, electricity, those kind of big asbestos, big sort of 5 or 6 activities that are involved in complying with building safety. There's also a question about the decent home standard. So many of you will be aware that that was the kind of the sole reference in the government's recent UK government's recent levelling up paper, is about halving the number of non-decent homes. So there's a reference to decency in there. We're still using obviously the 2006 decent home standard, but that is going to be updated very soon. It's in the process of being updated at the moment. We've got resident voice in there, so that's looking at things like satisfaction, satisfaction levels, and there's no sort of strict criteria. It's not like you've got to use a particular type of survey. It's more about, you know, measuring satisfaction and how have you measured it and what is your result. Complaints, it more or less is in line with the Ombudsman, though because it covers the UK, it has to cover 4 different ombudsman services. So there's a sort of bit of a sort of wording fudge in there, but it's looking at the volume of complaints you've got and how you deal with them, and also the opportunity that residents have to scrutinise your business. So there's open-ended questions there looking at scrutiny arrangements for residents. Resident support is about how you actually help residents to sustain their tenancies, how you're sort of improving quality of life for them. Again, open-ended questions, and it's an opportunity for you to sort of say how good you are at putting investment resources back into the community where you manage your stock. And so there's also a similar focus on that, but that's looking at working with partner agencies. So who are you involved with to actually make to sort of underpin the improving life outcomes work that you're doing to support residents. So you obviously need to work with partner agencies as part of that. There's an opportunity to demonstrate what you're doing in that area. Okay, so I'll move on to governance and then have another quick pause for questions. So this is the final part of ESG in the sustainability and reporting standard. This is looking at, you know, some fairly kind of basic questions. You know, are you registered with a regulator? You know, what is your status? You know, the kind of the G&V type stuff. And that has different ratings in different parts of the UK as well. So it's sort of worded in such a way that you can enter what you need to that's relevant to your country. There are plenty of questions in there about boards and trustees. So they're asking you to demonstrate, you know, what the balance is between different genders on your board, and looking at the ethnicity of board members, looking at how long they've been in post, looking to see that you have arrangements to make sure that they can't just stay forever. There's even a question that says, is your chief executive and chair a different person, or are your chief executive and chair different people? So they're quite sort of basic, but it's amazing how many landlords were unable to answer that question and then publish the information on their website, so which is something I'll come on to later on. And then there's questions on staff well-being, and so it's just, again, fairly sort of simple numerical questions. Sickness, you've got the chief exec to average pay, gender pay gap, and what's support you provide to staff. So obviously quite important through the pandemic and the big shift to home working and hybrid working. So that's quite an important part. But again, I think it's sort of fairly kind of simple stuff to actually gather. It's just whether you actually already have mechanisms to do that in the first place. And then we come back to procurement in here. So looking at how your supply chain, how you manage the supply chain from a kind of governance point of view to create social value. How are suppliers encouraged to put value back into the communities where you work? So there's an opportunity to explain that as well. And all of this, don't forget, is so that you can access preferable loan rates. So that's the kind of the purpose of it. Okay, so that's a quick sort of whistle stop through tour through the governance. There are sort of full documentation available on the Sustainability and Reporting Standard website. It's not a kind of HouseMark website, but it's obviously stuff that we do, so it's worth considering. Steve, have there been any questions?
We've got one that's just come in. Which is, I don't know if you're going to come to this, John, but it's how would you measure improvements to life outcomes, quality of life, and evidence that kind of positive contribution? So you might be about to deal with that if you're going to go over the metrics. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, it's an open-ended question, so it's kind of up to the landlords to make that demonstration. There is guidance available on the ESG website that sort of says a tiny bit more detail, but really it doesn't have any prescriptive recording mechanisms for that. It doesn't say, you know, you've got to use, I don't know, the hacked measure or something like that. It's up to landlords to be able to demonstrate that. So think of it a bit like a kind of an interview question.
Right. Okay. So that's very much over to the user. So if it's very definitely well-being, I could imagine a lot of people shuffling off down the hacked route, because that specifically is coming at it from the punters. If you like, the impact on the individual that's receiving the benefit of that. But I'm guessing SROI, social return on investment, or even cost benefit analysis, there are other methodologies available. If somebody wanted to have something that isn't just coming at it from the well-being angle, they could adopt one of those methodologies.
Yeah, I think so. I didn't see an awful lot when I was looking through the data that we collected last year based on early adopters. I didn't see an awful lot of, oh, we've used this particular metric. It was more about an open-ended response to sort of demonstrate, that they are working with the community. There's quite a lot in there, because the first set of these was looking at the kind of the 2021 year, when the pandemic struck, and so there was quite a lot of narrative about what landlords had done to help tenants through the early stages of the pandemic.
Right, and so I'm right in thinking that this is very much a mixture of metrics, like quantitative measures, and then, like you say, more a kind of a narrative, a qualitative assertion of where you are with something. But I guess what you're saying is, if you're kind of in that kind of qualitative narrative assertion of what you're doing, for that to be credible, it needs to be backed up with some kind of quantification. If you've said that you're helping X amount of people in a specific certain way.
Yes,
right.
yes. Because although they are standard questions, the answers aren't. For the open-ended questions, the answers aren't standardized, so there's no kind of standardized response yet. I mean, maybe there will be as time goes on and landlords kind of get the idea about what they're supposed to do, or whether it sort of chimes with the financial institutions that they are looking to apply for loans for. So again, thinking about it from this point of view, you're basically writing an application for a loan. What would a financial institution rate more? Would they sort of see social return on investment as a number? Would they appreciate that more than actually reading some narrative about how many tenants you've helped sustain their tenancy when they were on the brink of eviction or something like that?
Okay. All right. Thanks. I've still got some questions, but I'll let you crack on and I'll come back with it.
Right. Okay. So I'm moving on now to collecting ESG data. So as I mentioned just now, the ESG social housing website has details about how to collect all of this with the criteria that you need, a full set of guidance documents. They're not, and I just want to emphasize, it's not kind of HouseMark. Obviously we have our own kind of set of criteria that covers, cost, satisfaction, performance. This is something where we've kind of adopted it from an external standardized publicly available source. So that's kind of owned by the ESG in social housing group, and the criteria and documents are kind of their intellectual property. So much of the data I feel is already collected. I've kind of gone through that and highlighted it where it's available, and I found, so even where an early adopter hadn't published a specific report for ESG last year, many of them had already sort of published the information in things like annual reports or financial statements. A lot of that kind of qualitative and quantitative information is already available. And other sort of strategies are often published as well, so you can kind of piece it together, even if you don't actually have a specific exercise to collect it. So what ESG early adopters pledged to do was to publish a self-assessment against SRS, Sustainability and Reporting Standard criteria, on their website. When we looked at this last autumn, there were about sort of between 50 and 55 housing associations had signed up to be early adopters, and probably out of those, 30 had actually published a self-assessment that we could quite easily just download and look through. The remainder, we were able to kind of piece together quite a lot of the information, as I mentioned above. But we did find that there were several gaps in these self-assessments, just where it was kind of silent. Some of them sort of go through the criteria and actually kind of say, it's almost like a sort of a form. Their self-assessment works like that. Some of them approached in a much more sort of marketing kind of narrative way, and you've kind of got to read through it and work out which bits they're answering and see which bits the self-assessment is silent on. But we did find that sometimes the gaps where it was silent was just as interesting as the recorded results. And so it was quite unanticipated, like how many landlords just did not publish some of the, say, governance criteria as well. And I'll come on to that in a moment. Steve, is there anything to?
No, at this point, just
okay.
Crack on. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So it sort of moves on nicely into how we actually went about this at HouseMark. So we kind of knew that there was all this data that was coming out that was going to be publicly available, been discussing it internally, and our director of data said, we've got to do something on this. We've got to be able to scrape this data. There was this idea that you can kind of get some code together and kind of fling it at the web, and then you can scrape the data out, and all the stuff that you need will just appear in a spreadsheet. When we actually talked to our IT guys about it, they said, no, it doesn't work like that. If you wanted to, say, scrape data by kind of pinging stuff at a website, and it's just a normal web page that's kind of updated, say, I don't know, say with weather or COVID cases or something, you can do that. But if you've effectively got to look for a PDF document that may or may not be there and may or may not be called a self-assessment for ESG, it's going to be really difficult and time consuming to do. So we wanted to kind of get onto this quickly. And so the way we did it was to literally go onto organizations, to housing associations websites, search up their ESG report, download it if it was there. If it wasn't there, it would normally be me that would go in and try and find it from other sources like financial statements and annual reports. So it was quite literally a kind of a manual scraping exercise. So what we would do then is we got all of that data, saved all of those files that we downloaded from publicly available sources and put the numbers and the narrative into a big spreadsheet. And it was quite simple, really, quite simple, but quite time consuming. And you require a degree of kind of expertise to be able to understand what you need to put in as ESG criteria and what you don't. So that's kind of why we were able to do it, and we were able to do it quite quickly because we've got that kind of knowledge of housing and knowledge of data collection. So that gave us a big spreadsheet, which then gave us benchmarking results. And in it wasn't really a first, but in a kind of an unusual way of going around it, meant we had a whole load of benchmarking data without our members having to actually key in results. So quite a lot of our benchmarking is about landlords themselves entering data for their own organization. But for this, we were able to go to a publicly available source, take it from members of HouseMark and non-members of HouseMark, and put it together in a spreadsheet and end up with an analysis report. And I put a link into the report there. It's freely available from our website. So this is what we ended up with, and we published it in, well, we put the stuff together in the autumn, in the run up to Christmas, and we published the report in January this year. And I'll just quickly go through this, but just before I do, Steve, have there been any other questions?
No, not at this stage yet.
Okay, great. So yeah, it's got a bit of information there about what it covers, the 48 criteria. And because we were doing this as a kind of one-off pilot trial type exercise, we covered the qualitative narrative information as well as the actual numerical data in there as well. And some of the things we did, we may not be able to replicate if we were sort of doing this more widespread. But it was really interesting to kind of go through that amount of information and try and understand where landlords were with their ESG work. So as far as environmental is concerned, we looked at things like the EPC ratings. So we were able to, using the 50 odd landlords results, we put together some estimates of how many social homes have EPC rating of D or lower. We're looking at across the UK here, so there's about 5 million social homes across the UK, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And what we found is like 1 in 4 landlords unable to report the rating for some or all of their properties. So that's 25% of landlords just simply could not say what EPC bandings they were, or didn't feel confident enough to publish it, make it publicly available. So this is where the gaps were just as important or just as noteworthy as the actual information itself. There's just a couple of other things in there. So EPC going forward is looking pretty good. So I think a way building is going to be one of the ways to sort of drag up the average EPC rating. Yeah, had this new build. So most of the new build homes seem to be a B EPC rating. So there were separate questions for new and existing stock in there. Greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, there were 43%, so fewer than half the early adopters were able to actually provide a full breakdown of these figures or provide estimates of what these figures were. So we've summarized it in what we did have, but this data is, I think the Office of National Statistics would call it experimental. So I I don't know how accurate the information is, and how much is estimated, and how good the systems are for doing that. I think that measurement of greenhouse gas emissions is an area where the sector will improve over the next few years. When we were looking at things like energy efficiency actions, looking at the bottom left corner, this is where I did what I call a coding frame. So I kind of went through all of the qualitative responses and simply coded them and said, okay, that's about improving building fabric, that's about strategic financial planning, that's about building efficient homes, and so on. And so they were the top 6. So the most mentioned energy efficiency action was about improving building fabric. So that whole kind of fabric first agenda seems to be where landlords are going, looking at improving existing stock. And just the last thing on there, ecology and resource management. Again, it's really difficult because you're looking at, there's just silence. You're looking at a kind of wall of silence here from many organizations. You can't, it was quite difficult for me to find a strategy if they were silent on it. It didn't seem to be sort of published. So there's quite a lot of work to do here, I think, for the sector to sort of look at getting water management, waste management, using responsibly sourced materials, and reducing pollutants. It's quite a lot of strategic work for the sector to start thinking about that. Okay, Steve, just interrupt me if there are any questions. So with social, there's questions on affordability. So this is looking at the relationship between market rent and what rent is being charged by landlords taking part. Now, this kind of shows to financial institutions, what it actually means to charge sub-market rent at a social landlord. It kind of actually shows them in numerical terms where they are benefiting, where social landlords benefit the community by meeting the needs of people whose housing needs are unmet by the market. And it also gives the opportunity to show how many social homes are being developed. So I mean, it tells us in the sector, what we already knew already, that landlords are not sort of trying to become developers. They're not, trying to become like Taylor Woodrow or something and develop solely for profit. There's a little bit of that going on, but it's quite risky, and landlords are much more about increasing the number of social homes that are available. I mean, that might be low-cost home ownership, it might be affordable rent, there might be social rent in there, but they all count as social homes. Some of the things in building safety and quality, so we've got things like fire risk assessments in there, and gas safety certificates in there. So that 35%, that's reflective of the COVID year. So the early part of the pandemic, gas compliance just sort of fell off a cliff, basically. Nobody knew whether they were allowed to go into people's homes. You're told, you can't mix, you can't go into people's homes, you can't meet people face to face. And so there was a bit of kind of, oh, what do we do? How does that affect health and safety stuff like doing gas servicing? And so for a few weeks, probably, maybe 6 weeks or something, there were contractors that didn't know if they had the right PPE, didn't know whether they had the permission to go in. Then all that was clarified by the health and safety executive. They said, yes, gas servicing kind of trumps the need for social distancing. You have to go in to do gas servicing. But the knock-on effect of that was that instead of having 2/3 of the sector compliant at all times with gas safety across the year, only 35%. And we've collected data that shows it being really quite low. So prior to the pandemic, we were finding at HouseMark that 68% of landlords complied with gas safety in 100%. Fire risk assessment, that's something where we've not really started to collect it, but we can see it coming in for English landlords as part of the consultation on consumer standards. So we imagine it will go in there and become a bit more sort of normal, and we'll start to see that kind of what gets measured gets done, and see that 77% start to creep up. Decent home standards. This is based on 60% of landlords said that they were fully compliant with the decent home standards. That means 40% had some element of non-decency in there. Quite a lot of debate going on inside housing as to, you know, who's more accurate, the landlord's figures that they're reporting to the regulator or the English Housing Survey. I don't want to get involved in that, but this is what was coming out of these ESG reports last year. Just moving on to resident voice before I get onto the qualitative stuff. So you can see there what I was sort of referring to earlier. So we've got perception surveys, transactional surveys. So Acuity will be able to talk to you in much more detail than I can about these. But you know, the English regulator is moving on to perception surveys. So transactional surveys still have their place, but perception surveys will end up being used, I guess, by 100% of English landlords taking part in this exercise. Then it also asks questions about focus groups and using complaints. So if you look at the English Housing Ombudsman Complaint Handling Code, there's a strong emphasis on actually learning from complaints in there. So if you're complying with the code, then you will be using your complaints. But we found that only 9% of landlords completing this exercise actually stated how and that they used complaints to learn from. So there's quite a lot of catching up to do there, I think. So looking at ways residents are involved, so there's formal groups, informal feedback as well. So the use of formal groups is quite well embedded, although I guess the regulatory emphasis on this has kind of waned slightly over the last decade. I can see it coming back in much more with the sort of white paper and subsequent consumer standards that the regulator is looking at in England. You look at Scotland, you know, it's already there. You look at the results for things like satisfaction in Scotland, complaints volumes. There's much more engagement with between landlords and residents going on there that is collected through the ARC process. So I can see that sort of happening far more. Looking at other things then, so we've got tenants on the board. This 31% actually said that, so it doesn't mean that the remainder, you know, the remaining percentage said that they didn't have tenants on the board. Some of them actually said 0, but quite a lot of them were just silent on it. We couldn't tell from the data whether there were tenants on the board. And then we had this together with tenants. So again, 18% of participants actively said that they used the NHF together with tenants program. Again, that doesn't mean that you know, 82% did not. It just means that it was silent on it. And then we found some interesting results there on the support provided. Again, this is qualitative data that I've categorized as part of reading through the narrative. So a lot of it was just general advice. You know, this is how we support tenants. It all seemed a little bit kind of low key, really, a little bit sort of reactive. So I think there's quite a lot of work that the sector can do to support residents and demonstrate that they are supporting residents. Looking at ways of, there's a specific question on reducing the impact of fuel poverty. So a good way for landlords to do that is to improve the energy efficiency of existing homes, which kind of harks back to the decarb work mentioned in the environmental section. And that kind of raising awareness about getting the most out of energy. That's going to become more and more important, obviously, with the increase in fuel costs. So the last part is looking at governance. So there's the gap between the gender pay gap. There's the median CEO to worker pay ratio. I think compared to the private sector, the kind of commercial sector, those figures are better. CEO pay is obviously quite different in social housing to what it is in financial institutions, even compared to some government institutions as well. So what was kind of interesting there is trying to sort of work it out. Okay, well, let's look at you know, let's look at other institutions where we can get like data available on it. So if you look at the civil service, the average civil servant pay is higher than the average sort of housing worker pay, and so the actual ratio is slightly less there, and that's certainly true with like the regulator of social housing as well. But if you compare it to like supermarkets, something like that, the ratio is better. 81%. So most landlords actually were quite upfront about paying the real living wage. Again, the remainder were either silent or saying they were working towards it, so they hadn't actually reached that yet. And it seemed to be there's a difference there depending on how much how many staff were employed on the care side of the business. A little bit on sickness absence there, looking at 6.3 days, which is a bit lower, and I think that was due to the pandemic. So people working from home had a positive impact on sickness absence, so fewer sick days, and we've measured that at HouseMark. Board demographics. So this is one where it was really interesting because there were just so many that just were silent on it. You know, that either didn't have any BAME people on the board, or silent on whether the board members had disability. So it's really something where I thought it's quite an easy thing to do, to publish, but not many landlords actually did so. So just to be clear, this 47% here, that was the median figure for those that did report data on it. So 47% of landlords reported data on it, and out of those, none of them reported disabled board members. Whereas you look at what they said for tenants, they said 54%. Sorry, if you look at what it says in the English Housing Survey, 54% of tenants were disabled. So it just kind of gives you an idea about underrepresentation in governance structures. Board tenure. Quite a lot of landlords were able to publish this, quite a lot of compliance there. It seems to be that the job that the, say, National Housing Federation is doing in England to make sure that governance structures are up to scratch seems to be working. Okay, Steve, are there any questions there?
I've got one question, but what I might do is just save it to the end. We've got about 10 minutes, John, if you wanted to canter through.
Yeah. So I haven't got too many more slides. Just the next one is about looking at ESG benchmarking in 2022. So this report, the report that I've just gone through, the links on the website, and you'll obviously have the slides after this webinar. It was a proof of concept. It showed that we can get the data, we can scrape it, however manual that process is, we can get hold of it, and we'll be putting it into our big kind of data warehouse this year. So we won't be collecting, we'll be focusing on more of the quantitative questions. So it might be a yes, no, or it might be a number, rather than looking at the narrative. But there's still scope for us to take that narrative information and analyze it elsewhere. It just won't be in our data warehouse and reportable on. So we've devised this data collection that uses all of the quantitative measures that are in the ESG data collection form, and that's going to go live for data entry on our website over the summer. So by the time you have your year-end figures, year-end kind of cost data and governance data, that will be ready for HouseMark members to input data. And we'll also integrate it into our reporting tool in the autumn, so that you can look at ESG benchmarking results alongside your other cost, performance and satisfaction data. So the idea of that is that you can then use comparative data, so you can see where your organization is compared to where the median is, and use that if you are applying for funds. Okay, so that's the last slide I have. Is just any questions now?
Right, thanks, John. I think it's really interesting. I'd encourage people to use the Q&A function for any questions they've got. I'll put them to John. We've still got a good 7 or so minutes. We can overshoot by a couple of minutes if we need to, I think. Yeah, question from Emma Langhorn, who looks to be a HouseMark subscriber, actually. And she's saying, just a comment, not a question, but could HouseMark think about including measures in their data collection that can be quantified to demonstrate improvements to life outcomes generally, following fabric first retrofit measures, not just in relation to ESG, i.e. reduction in health interventions?
Yes is the slightly tentative but short answer to that. So we're running a decarb research project at the moment. I don't think we're at the stage where we can start quantifying before and after. I went to like the retrofit summit in London in March, and there was a lot of talk about how to measure before and after energy efficiency works, and not a lot of agreement or standardization. I think we can start to move landlords in that direction, and then we can start to sort of look at that. But the whole kind of measuring energy efficiency before and after is very technical, as I can understand it, and I don't think we're there yet. We're 2 or 3 years off, I'd say.
Okay, thanks. And then a question from Duncan Tild, which is, to what extent are lenders currently considering ESG factors?
I don't know is the short answer to that one. But it's just what I've kind of heard from reading like social housing. It seems to be in there quite a lot. And when I have heard lenders speak at, say, various events, they have said it will become increasingly important. I don't know when it will become sort of mandatory. It's certainly not going to become mandatory in the short term. It's only the sort of second year of having any kind of standardized measures available. But I think it depends on the lender, depends on the financial institution, and depends on what sort of loan you're looking at taking out.
Yeah, I mean, that basically chimes with my understanding, because I think for decades the sector's managed to trade on basically an ESG type credentials, because it's the social housing sector. You know, basically the entire sector is geared towards a social good, if you like. So I think my understanding is the sector is already considered in that light. So it's had a bit of a free pass for quite a few years. My suspicion is that ESG has become especially important in the commercial sector, because commercial organizations are realizing, to get competitive rates, that funders are increasingly interested in the ethics of where their money goes. So in the commercial sector, they have to differentiate by having ESG criteria. And then what I think typically what happens is, as the commercial sector gets better and better at measuring and evidencing ESG, there'll be pressure on the social housing sector that this is a sector that exists for social purpose, and yet it's not measuring its social outcomes as well as the commercial sector. So I think you're right. I think there's going to be increasing pressure for them to do it. In the absence of any more questions, John, I've got one for you, which is, you'll know from my time when I was working with you at HouseMark, how we wrestled with this issue about how you actually try to quantify the social and economic benefits of social housing. And we really wrestled with it. And I'd say it was the biggest challenge that I ever had when I was a director there, to try and get to the bottom of this. To what extent do you think this initiative is forget the financing side of things, let's just get to how does the sector evidence the social and economic good that it generates? How far do you think this initiative goes in answering that question?
I think it goes to show that there are gaps at the moment. So and it's a good sort of demonstration of that maxim, like what gets measured gets done. So if landlords have this degree of standardization and set questions, albeit qualitative answers to those questions, I think there's a much greater chance of them being able to sort of demonstrate and get their heads around what they need to do. And if there is a sort of financial incentive to do that, then there's a good carrot there.
Yeah, and I'd just say, I've kind of done my own little kind of high-level sweep across this stuff, and I actually think I think it goes a long way to answering a lot of questions. And if some of those, the qualitative elements of this are backed up with some kind of credible methodology behind it, so that if somebody's asserting, yes, I can do this, and yes, we are having this positive benefit, if it is backed up by things like HACT or some other form of measurement system in those kind of particularly social areas, I think the combination of things that they're looking to cover here goes a long way to answering that real difficult question that we've been trying to bottom out in the sector for a long time. I don't think we're ever going to get away from doing something like a HACT study or an SROI, particularly where an organization, whatever that study is trying to do, whether it's well-being or it's trying to look at, say, the impact of a massive improvement program, or it's looking at the impact of a massive, if you like, person-centered intervention, I think there's no way you're going to properly evidence it without doing something like SROI. And with this kind of complementing it, I do think for the first time in about 15 years since I've been looking at it, I think we've moved things on a bit, which I think is really positive. Yeah, and it's obviously helped. It's helped by the regulatory environment as well. Exactly, and I think there's a segue to this. Obviously we've got consumer regulation coming up, so that heaps a massive focus on the consumer. But as far as existing VFM regulation is concerned, I think a lot of this deals with the V in VFM. It helps us paint a picture of value. So I think there's a number of a happy serendipity going on here that I think will just enable the story to tell whoever the stakeholder is a more compelling story about the good that the sector does, instead of some airy-fairy, we're really good because we do all this good stuff sort of thing. Right, I've just had something come in from Duncan that's just simply saying, excellent presentation. Thanks, John. So yeah, it was great. John, thanks for your time and effort. It will be really interesting to see how this gathers momentum, and it'd be great to get you back at some point in the future. Pleasure. Right, and thanks everybody else for turning up. As I said, John's presentation and a recording of this will be available on our website shortly. I really would encourage people to check out the documents that John's referred to. It will really fill in the detail for you, and yeah, I think anybody that's interested in this area will find it really useful. So thanks again, and thanks, John. Okay, thank you. Right, bye everyone. Bye.